So once again, it's a platform, platform, research and expandability. It's a wonderful possibility to have you, and you are one of the researchers. It is always to experience and their comments to see what they have to offer in our society, so that we can also experience betterment in our society. The very focus of research sociology research channel is to make it into a better and quality database in order to expand, in order to improve research and academics. So we are glad to have you, and I would like to now switch on to my first question. Important question. It says human rights in India are a complex issue due to the country's large size, population, and diverse culture. Please comment on that. Is that a reality? Do you agree with it?
Thank you. It's great to be talking to you. I'm glad to be here. So, human rights. Let's situate human rights. When you say human rights, we're talking about rights that are inherent to all human beings, regardless of factors like their race, their gender, their sex, their nationality, their ethnicity, their language, religion, or socio-economic status or whatever. When you say human rights, generally people jump to armed conflict and human rights that has come from and it's true that largely the human rights discourse internationally has also sort of been derived from after the Second World War, from the Geneva Conventions, the ICCPR. But the body of human rights, the humanitarian law and the human rights law, all encompass both armed conflicts and non-armed conflicts as well. So just situating it here, the international human rights law also applies in peacetime. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're only looking at armed conflicts, over internal tensions, over internal disturbances, and it lays on obligations that the states are bound to respect. And India is a large country. Geographically, it's big. Culturally, religiously, linguistically, it's very diverse. And naturally, in such a big, such a diverse country, there are a lot of factors that make up that constitute this big country. So you have differences in religion, you have differences in language, you have systems like the caste system, you have differences in health service and delivery, you have the issues of climate and displacement, you talk about the traditional rights when we come to freedom of expression, when we come to when we talk about the freedom or the right to protest or criticize your state. And then more recently, now we also talk about digital rights and human rights over the digital space. So all of these things are all of these aspects of rights are present in India, and what we need to understand here is that there is a cultural relevance and cultural nuances that sort of shape your understanding of human rights. So if it's a patriarchal society like we consider India, we have to understand that our understanding of human rights and who should be getting what sort of rights is the general understanding is shaped by these cultural nuances. For example, let's talk about survivors of sexual violence or gender-based violence. Now, this is a society where there is social stigma and shame surrounding this topic, and it's deeply entrenched in the society. So their families, they frequently face victimization, they frequently face social rejection, and then here you have to bring in how do you tie the concept of victim rights to it, or your right to live in your society as with dignity. So these are the things we need to understand about India and its vast context.
But responding, and it's important to understand, as you mentioned, humanitarian laws and human rights structure in our context. In context is very different. Our culture is very much important, playing role. Our historicity is again a responsible factor. Making it whether we do have a fertile ground for human rights to happen or there is a disconnect. It's like we certainly experience challenge in our context, but it is also globally experienced. Important comments. That's what I figure out. Thank you so much for responding, such as in a smart perspective. Would like to move on to my second question. It's again an important question. Is the Constitution of India a strong safeguard? Is the Constitution of India a strong safeguard for the protection and promotion of human rights? Please comment.
The Constitution of India is one of the largest documents. It's a comprehensive document, and civil and political rights, as well as economic, social, and cultural rights, are enshrined in the document. So, in part 3 of the Constitution, Articles 12 to 35, they guarantee most of the rights that are also contained in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a document that is internationally recognized and adopted by the state. So the Article 32, for example, guarantees the right to constitutional remedies. We have the Article 21, which is life and liberty. So these rights are enshrined in the Constitution, and I think one of what we will possibly also talk about later, and which holds true here, is the constitutional remedies right. So you have the right to live freely. You have the right to have your own religion, which is also enshrined in the Constitution. The right against untouchability, or the prohibition of untouchability. The right to have a family. The right to have your there are other social economic rights enshrined in here as well. And then what Article 32 does is sort of guarantee a protection of these rights. In case these rights are violated, then it makes it the constitutional mandate of the judiciary to protect the human rights of the citizen. I think that's quite an important part of the Constitution. So that's under Article 32, it's the Supreme Court, and then under Article 226, it's the High Courts that take action to enforce the fundamental rights. So an aggrieved person, a person who feels like their rights have been violated, constitutional rights specifically, they can directly approach the court for the protection of their rights, and the courts are empowered to issue direction or orders for redressal of these grievances, and ensuring that these fundamental rights that the Constitution calls them are protected, and people enjoy these rights, having these rights. Then, complementary to the provisions of the Constitution, we also have the Protection of Human Rights Act, which was adopted in 1990, I think, and it sort of provides an organization structure for protecting human rights, and also I think acts as a repository of evidence collection, or as a repository of information on the kinds of grievances that people have against human rights, and what sort of actions have been taken. It establishes a human rights commission at the national level and then in each state, and also provides for the setup of human rights courts, etc. But again, and we'll talk about these limitations further as well, but this human rights commission is a fact-finding body only, and it does not have any legislative power. So it's an advisory body to the government. It does not have power to adjudicate, issue any order to any party or any government, and then it's completely up to the discretion of the state whether they accept the advices and the recommendations of the Human Rights Board. And then another thing that sort of limits the power of this general national body is that states are not obligated to set up commissions in their particular state, and then union territories generally do not have these commissions. They fall under the national human rights. So while there are protections, definitely, and there are guarantees that the Constitution makes and other provisions have been made over the years to sort of make sure that human rights of citizens are protected, there are also limitations that come with this.
Wanted to frame you on this important question here: constitutional mechanism and strong safeguards, specifically try and focus human rights, and tremendous information, large body of data we've heard, and I'm sure the audience will have benefit looking at your insight and information. Would like to move on to my third question, which is this way: says, what are the gender dimensions? Important question. What are the gender dimensions of the human rights discourse in India? Please comment.
So, gender is an important aspect of rights. And when we established earlier, and we talked about earlier, how you have to contextualize how gender fits within a particular discourse of a particular country. Now, the rights dialogue around gender is different in India than it would be in Western countries. And then we have to contextualize it in the way that gender is presented in India. So it's a rather traditional society, a patriarchal society where men are assumed to be in charge for the large part, especially in more socioeconomically disadvantaged groups, and then here in a patriarchal society, descent and inheritance are paternally traced. Men are generally in control of the family resources, and even even if this is changing, this has largely been the practice for generations, and it definitely is not something that will go away, right? And this inherently puts women at a social disadvantage. It prescribes traditional gender roles. So women are prescribed a docile nature and an inferior position where they perceive to be other with just housework and childcare, and men are expected to serve. Men are expected to provide for the family, and their role in childcare, for example, is not that highly valued. Whereas women are expected to serve the husband and his family, and it gives impetus to factors that legitimize and also perpetuate violence against women, such as male entitlement or sexual objectification of women. So this is the context within which we talk about the gender rights. Now there are also different dimensions of rights for women as well, and these broadly exist, right? So we have the right to education. There are, as you know, particular schemes for educating women, and the necessity for that has come up because we have a patriarchal society where historically this has not been, freely provided for. Whether it's a social structure, a familiar belief, or a religious belief, whatever. Then you have the right to employment, have a family, to get married, to have your own religion, etc. And then also to live with dignity and to live free from violence. So, which specifically when we talk about gender rights, I would like to talk about the rights of women in the context of gender-based violence or sexual violence. We define gender-based violence as harmful acts that are gender-based violence as harmful acts that are directed at an individual based on their gender. Right? And they are rooted in gender equality, the abuse of power and harmful norms, and is considered by the High Commissioner for Refugees, for example, as a serious violation of human rights and a life-threatening health and protection issue. So that's how the UNHCR defines gender-based violence. These can be of physical, sexual, psychological, or economic nature. And this can also be workplace harassment. It could be abuse in online digital spaces. We were just talking about the rights in digital spaces, right? Social ostracization, whether you have financial independence. And while it's gender-based violence is focused on gender, and largely the victims of gender-based violence in India have been women. So, and while it's a critical, aspect of determining gender-based violence, it also intersects with other factors like your sexuality, like what socioeconomic category you belong to. So some minorities are particularly vulnerable to gender-based violence, like women belonging to the scheduled class, for example. In 2020, I think there were about over 4,000 cases of sexual violence against colored and scheduled tribal women reported in India. So there are categories in this within gender as well, depending on other factors, where it would make you more vulnerable to a certain kind of violence. And then we talk about conversation on bodily autonomy and sexual and reproductive health rights, which is also generally, even though there are provisions for getting these medical procedures, it does not mean it's socially acceptable as well. Like we talked about, there's a social context to it as well. So, and then India, like you said, is a big country, and there are instances of a violence against women in situations of, for example, communal violence, right? Where during periods of communal rights, or in places with some internal conflict, like we have in the north or the northeast, or these places, these conflict-affected places, where women find themselves at the short end of the stick as well, and sexual violence is often used as a tool of oppression, in conflict regions. So, for example, and here we talk about the rights of women come into it. So the rights again are A, protection from this kind of violence, and B, seeking redressal from this kind of violence. So if they have been aggrieved in such a heinous manner, they should be able to then seek remedy from the state. And in cases of gender-based violence, as we know, it's majorly a sensitive issue, and it brings with it the conversation of, oh, what was the character of the woman, right? What was she wearing, for example, or questions about her integrity, questions about her purity and the dignity and the shame and the honor of the family, etc. All of these questions become intertwined when we talk about any form of gender-based violence. And then the legislation that comes from it and the redressal mechanisms that come from it, they do not then focus on the rehabilitation of these survivors, right? So we have criminalization of these instances. We have criminalization of sexual violence in the what was the Indian Penal Code and is now the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita. But where it sort of falls short of fulfilling its obligation of, providing all like comprehensive rights for these survivors is that there is no psychosocial rehabilitation of them. That's not the focus. And then again, tying into rights and sort of security here, for example, custodial rape is a punishable offense, right? But with the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, armed force personnel, they remain outside of the purview of prosecution for custodial rape as well. And then you have the question like, what is the trade-off with security and human rights, right? And again, this ties into the general dialogue of how we perceive human rights as well. So what is the limitation on these kind of human rights? But broadly, it's a complicated topic. And I've touched upon a very small aspect of it when it comes to gender-based violence as well. But it's an interesting conversation.
It's really important to learn your perception, your ideas, and not just ideas, but deep insights, research based, and to know how gender dimensions influence the practice of human rights in our context, and not just in our context, but globally. What are instrumental laws and policies and context, legal mechanisms, and how they are influenced, how they are directed and shaped. Thank you so much for engaging on this wonderful perception and giving your insights, deep comments. Would like to move on to my fourth question, which is this way. What are India's international obligations? What are India's international obligations in connection to the protection of human rights?
As we talked about in the beginning, we have the international humanitarian law and the international human rights law, which describe sort of what the conduct of the states should be in armed conflict as well as in peace. And it lays down the obligations of the international human rights law. It lays down the obligations that the governments have to act in a certain way or to refrain from acting in certain ways in order to protect and promote human rights and fundamental freedoms of its citizens, of its groups. And the foundations of this body of law have been the Charter of the United Nations, the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, respectively, right? And then the United Nations, over the years since its establishment in 1945, has gradually expanded human rights law to encompass specific standards for women, as we talked about, children, persons with disabilities, and other minorities and vulnerable groups. Because we said there are certain sections, certain minorities that are more vulnerable to violations of human rights than others. And this also includes the right to protect them from discrimination as well. And that is prevalent in societies like, we would consider an inequality or a discrimination based on gender in a patriarchal society. So back to our context. The human rights which are inherent to all human beings, and everybody is entitled to these rights. And this means that the obligation on the state, and here India, because India is part of the United Nations, has adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, signed the treaty when the United Nations was established, as signatory to the ICCPR and other mechanisms and protocols and treaties that have been established in humanitarian and human rights. So it means that the obligation of the state of India is to take positive action to facilitate the enjoyment of these human rights. And then the Constitution also enshrines some of these. So there is this connect between what the internationally India is obligated to and how it sort of operates on the ground. Now that's not necessarily, it's not always, 100% a straight line as we talked about. Like, for example, it's a basic rule of international law that if there has been a breach of duty, in this case ensuring human rights, then there is an obligation by the state to provide reparations for the same. again, when you talk about reparations, they're usually talked about in the context of armed conflicts, but they're also valid in like peace times. So there reparations include restitution, where you attempt to re-establish a situation that existed before the harm or injury was caused, a compensation for financial or non-financial losses, rehabilitation, to sort of help with the long-term medical, psychological, legal sort of the aspects that come out of human rights violation. And then a guarantee of non-competition. So and then also the satisfaction, which includes formal acknowledgement of like the violation has taken place. So these five sort of reparation, these aspects usually come under armed conflict, but it's like an established discourse around human rights, and in spirit, these are in one way or the other, sort of adopted by states in general. So, like in terms of compensation, there are provisions around it in many states. In terms of rehabilitation, there are provisions in many states, and we talked about how there are these aspects lack in the Indian legal context when we talk about the implementation of these policies. So India has ratified the Geneva Conventions, it has ratified the ICCPR, and these are arguably some of the most important conventions for human rights protection. But then it is also it hasn't adopted I think it was the additional protocol on the ICCPR. It has reservations on how internal armed conflicts are categorized or understood. And then there is the usual state discourse on what is like we talked about, trade-off between security and human rights. So where is it okay to curtail freedom of expression? Where does protest become something that is not the right of the citizen anymore, right? How do you, what about in the digital space? Or when you take provisions like Armed Forces Special Powers Act or the Public Security Act or the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, all of these things together. So there is also this pull between the human rights advocacy and then the established conversation of states' rights. So there is this pull between states' rights and the human rights of its citizens, which has come up time and again in history, and I'm sure it will keep coming up, and this will continue to remain a point of contention.
Thanks a lot to your deep and insight comments, because international obligations and then protection of human rights, these things have never been easy, though there's been existential possibility in reality ever since the inception of human history. We figured out a lot of traditional, cultural, historical documents and practices existing human rights, but how their practices have been toward gamut, toward comprehensive dimension, that is something which is to be sort of peeped into, sort of to be, we need to analyze specifically developing nations. And in a context, we do come across institutions, mechanisms practicing human rights with the violation and gender-based violation within the house and outside the house. It's something very important, because a bit of my study also have I have pinpointed those issues. But thanks a lot for responding. Would like to move on to my fifth and the final rapid question. Again, one question, ma'am. It says, what has been the role of civil society? Iman, what has been the role of civil society in the advocacy for human rights in India?
It's always been a crucial aspect in any kinds of rights. And we talked about gender-based violence, and you were just talking about the difference between the existence of a policy and legislation and the implementation of it. So there is sort of a gap between the policy and its implementation, whether it's based on capacity, training, sensitivity, and I'm talking specifically, let's say, for gender-based violence. But there are significant gaps that exist in the state's undertaking of its responsibility to handle issues of human rights violations and human rights protections. And then therefore there is a turn to local community-based organizations that work on the agenda of human rights violations. You have organizations that contribute to research and evidence generation, organizations that work directly with victims and survivors of human rights abuses, that document abuses and advocate for improvement and policy changes. And there are also organizations that offer psychological support, organizations that offer legal support, etc. Uh, and in India, this is a vibrant scene as well. So let's specifically look at violence against women. NGOs in India have always been at the forefront of protecting women's rights. They engage in research, advocacy, relief programs, awareness, changing social perception regarding harmful gender stereotypes, like we talked about the traditional roles earlier. Now, NGOs, why are they can be considered more effective? It's because they reach the vulnerable and disaffected women in communities better than large-scale institutions or a government at the center in a separate state, right? Um, and they're able to find more innovative and more personal solutions as well. Um, and then women often seek informal help, so they go to these organizations when it particularly, for example, comes to domestic violence or intimate partner violence, because of the sensitivity of the issues, that there is a stigma and taboo surrounding this, there are stereotypes surrounding this. So therefore, women also like to go for the sort of help that would not, drag the names in public, where they don't have to, go to courts and try to convince authorities of the existence of violence in the first place. In India, civil society has a long history of the ideals of giving and seva, as we say, service. Voluntary organizations, as early as the medieval times, they were involved in cultural development, health, education, disaster relief, and then as nationalist consciousness spread across India during the freedom movement under the British colonial rule, there were many social in India. And then after independence, the government intensified its involvement in social welfare and development, but this was not without recognizing the role that civil society had played. So the Central Social Welfare Board was established in the 50s to promote social welfare activities and support people's involvement in NGOs. So as a result, the number of professional NGOs in India has increased, and I think in 2020 there were about 3 million registered NGOs. But again, we've been saying there are positives, but there are also limitations. India does not have a national policy that addresses the workings of the non-profit sector, and this leaves the state-civil society relations rather unburdened. Now, we talked about there are inherent social, religious, ethnic, and economic differences in the Indian society, which means that it definitely also reflects in this civil society here, and which is also permeated by inequality. And these are a large number of organizations which are usually, they rely on donations and fundings, and a lot of it is also, state funding. So they're battling against limited resources. So naturally there is inequality in the society of this as well. And then the fact that there is no national framework, it sort of adds to this competition as well. Now, when we particularly speak of human rights, it's a sensitive issue, right? Because you think of human rights, you think of, oh, can I tweet this thing, right? Can I say this thing? Is going to this protest going to be difficult? If I publish this paper, is it going to be a problem? And this is an issue that each state grapples with, right? We talk about states' rights versus human rights. So curtailing expression, protest, criticism, and civil society is particularly vulnerable to this as well. NGOs that are operating in India have increasingly in the previous years seen rising restrictions, right? And there is a rising restriction in the civic space and the functioning of civil society organizations. And in this particularly advocacy and rights-based groups, like human rights groups or organizations that particularly work on these sensitive topics, they tend to face great state pressure and government restrictions as well. There is, regulatory requirements which have recently been made more burdensome and sort of hamper the functioning of NGOs. During the pandemic, there was an unprecedented regulatory changes in the sector which made it difficult for organizations to get in relief work. For example, there was changes made in the Foreign Contributions Act, the FCRA, the Regulatory Act, and where government suspended or cancelled foreign funding permissions for a lot of non-profit organizations, right? And this takes resources away from civil society and sort of hampers the gap they're trying to fill where state implementation sort of fails. So it's quite an important aspect of human rights conversations in India definitely, and needs more diving deeper.
Okay, so thank you so much, Farinji, responding to these five important questions, and one like the one question about the civil society organizations and their role in advocacy and lobbying is important. And we know it even in our childhood, we've heard a lot, but to kind of, it's highly appreciative your knowledge, your in-depth, your insight, the way you've shared your perceptions and theoretical and just constitution mechanism also we figured out. So I'm sure that I'm confident it is going to help our audience at large, though we do not have a large audience. But I mean, the number of people we're just starting, but it's always good to have people like you because you're not just indulging in academic pursuits. There's nothing nasty indulging in academic pursuits, but your research is something which it's outspoken, it speaks, and you have a good knowledge. You sort of briefed us up, not just briefed, but given us a comprehensive instrumental knowledge and practical knowledge on human rights and what are the mechanisms, legal context, and legal possibilities, specifically covering Indian context. Thanks a lot joining RISO and giving your precious time. As I've already mentioned, the very purpose, very thematic base and fundamental base of RISO at the back of it is to cover and sort of expand and explore possibilities, expanding sociological perspective and sort of causing expansion in research and academics so that the same can be used as database for various sections of the people across the globe I'm talking about. That's the reason. Thanks a lot joining for NG RISO platform.